Welcome to today's Division III webinar for Bylaw 17 season activities. I'm John Purcell. My co-presenter is Tiffany Alford. We are assistant directors for the Division III Academic and Membership Affairs team.
So our agenda for today, we're going to look at two specific areas. I'm going to start us off with physical activities outside the season, with a specific focus on strength and conditioning activities and captain's practice and the related legislation to that captain's practice. Then we're going to pass it over, I'm going to pass it over to Caitlin to talk about non-physical activities outside the season, and she'll be focusing specifically on leadership programming and team building activities along with social media connections. So first we're going to start with a base definition of athletically related activity. Athletically related activities are prohibited outside the declared playing and practice season. And we usually use a definition or look at a definition of practice when we're thinking of athletically related activities, but Bylaw 17-0211 also includes definitions or descriptions that are more closely related to out-of-season activities with a strength and conditioning coach. Two of those are individual workouts required or supervised by a member of the coaching staff, and involvement of an institution's strength and conditioning staff with enrolled student athletes in required conditioning programs. So this includes individual workouts or these things that are supervised or required for an institution. Those would be considered athletically related activities. For strength and conditioning workouts to be accepted from athletically related activities, they must be voluntary, they must be conducted by a strength and conditioning coach who is certified by a nationally recognized program, and they must be conducted during the regular academic year. If the certified strength and conditioning coach is also a sport coach or a staff member on a team, that coach must also conduct voluntary workouts for all student athletes. For monitored workouts to be accepted from athletically related activity, they must also be voluntary, and they may only be monitored for safety by a strength and conditioning coach who can be certified or non-certified. Additionally, if the strength and conditioning coach is also a sport coach or a staff member on a team, that coach may only monitor if they perform monitoring duties for all student athletes using this facility at the same time. In addition to those exceptions specifically related to working with a strength and conditioning coach out of season, there's also legislative exceptions that relate specifically to the use or reservation of strength and conditioning facilities. So Bylaw 17-02-11141 discusses those exceptions. Student athletes may use student athlete-only facilities for voluntary workouts at any time. Certified strength and conditioning coach may conduct voluntary workouts in student athlete-only facilities, and then certified strength and conditioning coaches may reserve institutional facilities for voluntary workouts that individual will conduct. I'd ask that you please keep these exceptions in mind, or this whole area in mind, when we discuss captain's practices later in this webinar. So sometimes we get questions about, what does it mean to be a nationally recognized program and what qualifies? Division III legislation does not include a list of acceptable strength and conditioning certifications or certifying agencies. Instead, an August 1st, 2011 educational column provides education and suggested best practices that institutions should consider when evaluating a certification or a certifying agency. Specifically, institutions should consider whether the certifying strength and conditioning agency, 1, is accredited by an oversight organization, 2, requires an undergraduate college degree, 3, requires a continuing education component, and 4, requires current first aid, CPR, and AED use certification. So we've also talked a lot about the word voluntary and what it means for things to be voluntary athletically related activities as opposed to required. So Bylaw 17-0214 jumps more deeply into that. In order for an athletically related activity to be considered voluntary, all of the following conditions listed on the slide must be met. So 1, a student athlete must not be required to report back to any of his or her sport-specific coaches any information related to the activity. In addition, no athletics department staff member who observes, monitors, or conducts the activity, thinking strength coach, a trainer, a manager, none of those people may report back to the student athlete's coach any information related to the activity. Number 2, the activity must be initiated solely by the student athlete. Neither the institution nor any athletics department staff member may require the student athlete to participate in an activity at any time. 3, the student athlete's attendance and participation in the activity, or lack thereof, may not be recorded for the purposes of reporting such information to coaching staff members or other student athletes. And finally, the student athlete may not be subjected to penalty if he or she elects not to participate in the activity. In addition, neither the institution nor any athletics department staff member may provide recognition or incentives to a student athlete based on his or her attendance or performance in the activity. So now we're going to jump into our first example. These are questions that staff has actually received through our RSRO system and has had an opportunity to discuss. We've given interpretive responses back to institutions who ask these questions, so not made up. These are completely questions that come from you all as the membership. So our first one is, during the non-traditional segment for the fall and spring student athletes, can lifting sessions be excluded from the 16 days of athletically related activity? And the answer to this question is, during the non-traditional segment, those lifting sessions would need to count towards one of the 16 countable days unless those sessions meet voluntary strength and conditioning exception that we discussed earlier. So that means they would have to be conducted by a strength and conditioning coach who's certified. The activity would have to be voluntary and not required for participation. Any participation in those workouts could not be reported back to the student athlete's coaching staff. And those workouts, that would be the only way for those workouts to not count towards the 16. So if any of those conditions aren't met, and if it's a required lifting session as part of a student athlete's involvement in the non-traditional segment, it would have to count towards one of the 16 dates. Here's our next question. Our strength and conditioning coach wants to offer a 6 a.m. lift for those who do internships. However, our regular gym will not open till 8 or 9 a.m. Is it permissible for our summer weight room hours for varsity-only weight room to be open earlier than the regular facility for non-athletes? And so for this question, we responded to say the legislation would not preclude the institution from opening the student-athlete facility earlier than the facility available to non-athletes. However, the strength and conditioning coach would not be permitted to conduct those workouts during the summer. Strength and conditioning coaches, whether they're certified or uncertified, may only monitor the facilities during the summer and may not provide instruction to student athletes. So there's a March 26, 2009 official interpretation that really provides the parameters around what it means to monitor. Monitoring can include observing and watching closely to ensure safety of the student athletes conducting, their strength and conditioning activities. It may also include demonstration of proper technique. However, a strength and conditioning coach may not instruct a student athlete to complete a specified number of repetitions or sets to ensure the student athlete maximizes his or her workout. So as a result, the strength and conditioning coach could monitor the facility to keep a safe environment during the summer, but a strength and conditioning coach would not be permitted to actually conduct summer workouts with student athletes. Our last example in this section, question number 3, the competition gymnasium is accessible to basketball and volleyball student athletes 24 hours a day, 7 days a week with their ID, which can be swiped to let themselves into their locker room and then into the gym. If this facility is not available for all students 24/7 or ever really to those students, can the student athletes use the facility anytime they would like? And so the answer to this question is if that's permissible during the academic year. So during the academic year, student athlete can access student athlete only facilities at their leisure. Additionally, if those facilities are for strength and conditioning and they're student athlete specific, student athletes may access those facilities at any time. In April 19, 2019, educational column provides some additional guidance and indicates that a student athlete may use a sport-specific facility outside the season, even if those facilities are not available to the general student population. And the bylaw that we had talked about earlier with reservation of facilities, so 1702-11141, permits student athletes to have access to student athlete-only facilities, strength and conditioning facilities for voluntary workouts at any time, and that includes the summer. And so the January 14, 2016 educational column that's listed on the slide provides additional information about the summer use of student-athlete-only strength and conditioning facilities. Okay, so I'm going to keep moving right along, and we're going to talk about captain's practice. So back in February, the Division III Twitter sent out a question about captain's practice, and the question was, or the statement was, captain's practices are permissible outside the declared playing and practice season. And as you can see from the results, 83% of the membership who responded, or folks who responded, thought that was true. But they're not. It's false. Captain's practices are not permissible outside the playing and practice season. So that led us to think, well, maybe there's a misunderstanding going on, and we should dive a little deeper to explain why captain's practices are not permissible outside of your 18, 19, or 24-week season. So prior to non-controversial proposal 2020-1, for purposes of NCAA legislation, and specifically for purposes of bylaw 17011 Part J, 0211 Part J, excuse me, a captain's practice was defined by the 4 bullet points on the screen, including the one that's currently blacked out. So prior to that non-controversial legislation, a captain's practice was on-court or on-field activities that were called by members of a team, that were limited primarily to members of that team, and that were considered to be required for participation in that sport. If a given activity fit each of these bullets, it was considered to be athletically related activity. And as I mentioned earlier, per Division III legislation, athletically related activities can only take place during the declared playing and practice season. As a result, any captain's practice is an athletically related activity and can only permissibly take place during the season, not outside the season. So did the non-controversial legislation, 2020-1, make captain's practices permissible at any time inside or outside the declared season? The answer to that is no. Captain's practices are still athletically related activities for purposes of Bylaw 17, and they are still impermissible outside the declared playing and practice season. Instead, the non-controversial legislation changed the definition of captain's practices. Specifically, it removed the 3rd bullet from this list. So as you can see, it's struck through here, the one that limited an activity to primarily members of one team. Now, a captain's practice is defined by the remaining 3 bullets. So on-court or on-field activities that were called by members of a team that are considered to be required for participation in that sport. This new definition does not change the fact that captain's practices are athletically related activities, and it does not change the fact that they are not permissible outside the season. So, how can you tell the difference between an impermissible out-of-season captain's practice and a permissible voluntary out-of-season activity that's limited to members of one team? The Interpretations and Legislation Committee approved an April 19, 2019 educational column to assist the membership in this area. The educational column clarified several areas regarding what constitutes required. It also focused on the reservation of facilities. A primary difference with the change is that a student athlete can now reserve a facility for use exclusively by teammates. Assuming it is a general use facility, then that opportunity has to be available to any student to so reserve that facility. Before, if a student athlete reserved a facility, it could be reserved for the specific activity, but not to limit the participants, as that would constitute a captain's practice. Since the definition no longer includes confined primarily to members of the team, this restriction is no longer applicable. So if the facility is a sports-specific facility, student athletes are permitted to access that outside the season at the discretion of the institution. This issue is also a change, but reflects concerns expressed by the membership regarding safety and liability with certain types of facilities. There are also several limitations that remained with this change to the legislation. The first is that coaches may not reserve the facilities for student athletes. And the second is coaches may not direct the student athletes to reserve the facilities. Additionally, a coach may not observe the activity even if their job function is to monitor facilities, if that facility is reserved for student athletes. This is consistent with the exception in Bylaw 1702-1113 C3, as the reserve facility is no longer open to the general student body. So even though the observation exception in 1701 would allow a coach who's monitoring to be in a facility with both, if that facility now is reserved specifically for a team or a group of student athletes, that coach would not be permitted to be monitoring the facility at that time. The other restriction that remains is that coaches may not provide any practice plans for activities that are voluntary out-of-season activities limited primarily to members of the team. There may be some discretion to provide some certain drills or videos that explain a drill, but they can't provide any type of plan that tells you how many or how much or how often an activity, a drill, a skill should be performed. All right, well, I'm going to pass things over then to Caitlin.
Thanks, Stephanie. So you get the question a lot on campus, and we often get it at the national office, what can your coaches do outside the season to help their student athletes further their development as athletes and as individuals? So the first step in answering that question is identifying whether there's an athletics nexus involved in the activity. If there is an athletics nexus in the activity, it runs the risk of being considered an athletically related activity or a practice activity. Practice is defined in Bylaw 170211 as any meeting, activity, or instruction involving sports-related information and having an athletics purpose held for one or more student athletes at the direction of or supervised by any member or members of the institution's coaching staff. And we know that the legislation prohibits a coach from being involved outside the season with their student athletes in athletically related activities. However, effective August 1st, there is a new legislated exception to athletically related activities for leadership programming. This would allow your coaches to engage in leadership programming that involves sports-related information with their student-athlete leaders outside the season, provided the programming satisfies all the conditions in the legislation, and you can see that on your slide. The first is that the programming must not include the practice activities defined in the legislation. So you can look to 170211 for the full list of practice activities, but to name a few, this would include floor or on-court activities, chalk talk, film review, competition, required weight training, camps, clinics, and individual workouts and practice called by members of the team. Second condition is the programming must occur during the academic year, and it must be completed no later than the 5 days before the start of the institution's official final exam period. The academic year is defined by the institution in their academic calendar. And while it may seem obvious, this exception to athletically related activities would preclude this type of leadership programming from occurring over the summer break. The programming must be limited to one 90-minute meeting per week, not more than 10 times outside the season. So this is a student-athlete specific restriction per sport, meaning that any given student-athlete cannot participate in more than one 90-minute meeting per week and no more than 10 sessions outside the season for their particular sport. So if you have a student-athlete who's a multi-sport student-athlete, for example, participates in football and outdoor track and field, that student-athlete could access 10 sessions for football and 10 sessions for outdoor track and field outside their seasons, with one 90-minute meeting per week restriction applying to each sport. The programming plan must also be submitted to the athletics director and compliance officer. So it's on the institution to determine the exact materials needed to properly document the leadership programming plan, and if any changes are made to the plan, they need to be on record as well. So some other things to keep in mind for this new legislation is that it's not permissible to engage in physical activities. So for example, a ropes course as part of the leadership programming. And who determines whether a student athlete is serving in a team leadership capacity? The coach. So could technically all of the team student athletes participate in this type of leadership programming? So could each student athlete get the opportunity to do this? Yes, there's no limit to the number of student athletes from a team that may be involved in leadership programming, but the intent of the legislation is for these programming sessions to occur in small group settings. and it's up to the institution to define what constitutes a small group based on the student athletes involved and the type of programming. Important to note as well, the institution may not finance the leadership programming unless similar programming is available to the institution's students. So this means the participating student athletes would have to pay for the programming and any associated costs such as transportation to and from the programming. And the programming itself does not have to occur on campus. Also, this type of leadership programming may not occur during an official vacation period. So I know we already talked about summer. It can't happen during summer, but it also could not happen between terms and before initial enrollment. All right, so say your coach wants to engage with their student athletes over the summer in leadership programming activities, or they want to engage with their entire team, not just the leaders. Where would that fit in the legislation? So Bylaw 1632 provides the parameters for such leadership programming activities, but unlike the new legislation, it only permits leadership programming to involve sports-related information outside the season if the following conditions are satisfied. First, there must be similar programming available to students generally. The programming cannot be limited to members of one team, and the participation needs to be voluntary. So these conditions matter because otherwise the activity starts to look like practice, which we know is not permissible outside the season. So also to note, there are some other considerations for this type of leadership programming. It is not permissible to participate in team bonding or team building activities outside the declared season. So even though team bonding activities are not explicitly mentioned in Bylaw 170211, team bonding implies that the activity is athletically related and would trigger the definition of practice. So regardless of whether the student athletes are paying for themselves or their participation is voluntary, team bonding or team building activities must occur during the playing and practice season. And as a final point for leadership programming, I would say don't automatically assume it's permissible leadership programming for the team if on its face the activity seems to not have an athletics nexus. So for example, a team Bible study with the coach, there needs to be a non-athletics reason for limiting the session to just the team. And if the activity constitutes a regular meeting between the team and the coach, like a weekly Bible study, there could be a perception that these activities are mandatory. A regular mandatory meeting with coach and student athletes would not be allowed outside the season.
So we've had a lot of flexibility in other areas of coaches and student athletes interacting this summer. Has there been any flexibility in the area of leadership programming?
I think that I would say the flexibility has allowed for athletically related activities to occur outside the season and for sports related information to be discussed in those discussions. So I believe so. I think it would probably be better to have an example. So I would just refer to the COVID-19 Q&A document and the parameters of flexibility in terms of the types of discussions you can have with them. I would say that these restrictions aren't necessarily applicable this summer, and the flexibility is listed in certain areas where they'd be able to engage with their prospective student athletes.
Caitlin, I think I would just add to that, you know, the summer flexibility that is granted through the administrative committee has a limited scope this summer, meaning any interactions that you are seeking to have with your student athletes must be voluntary from a student athlete perspective. So student athletes can't be required to take part in even the flexibility that's already granted, right? So the ability to have chalk talks or the ability to have those kind of interactions that would normally be prohibited in the summertime. If a student athlete chooses to engage in those interactions, they can do that, but they can't be punished for not doing it or receive any award for doing it. The purpose of the flexibility is really to foster those interactions between teammates, between coaches, and things of that nature. So keeping that at the heart, you know, the administrative committee, wanted to put some limitations to make sure that those interactions are only are voluntary and student athletes don't feel forced to take part in them.
I've got one question for you, Caitlin. Are community service events allowed outside the playing season?
So student athletes participating with their coaches outside the season in community service events?
Yes.
And we're talking about this summer, so.
I don't have any info if it's specifically related to COVID or if it's just any summer.
I would think so. I mean, I would think it would be permissible if there's not an athletics purpose, and similar to the leadership programming parameters that say if it doesn't appear to have an athletics purpose on its face, so you have to ask the question, why is it restricted to members of that team? And if there's not really an athletics purpose, or it doesn't start to look like practice, I would say it would be permissible for them to engage in the community service together.
Yeah, and there's a specific exception in our legislation that permits those types of activities, so long as there's no athletic ability being used by the student athletes. You can find that in Bylaw 17021112. It's titled Fundraising Activities as follows, and specific to community service activities, if there's no athletics ability that's being used by the student athletes, they're permissible, provided those activities have received approval from the institution's chancellor or president before the activities begun. So it kind of directs you back to the restrictions in Bylaw 12511 for promotional activities and things of that nature. So you would need prior institutional approval before doing any of those types of community service activities outside the declared season.
Thanks, Tiffany. Is there anything else?
I've got one more.
Okay.
About leadership programming. Do we require schools that want to engage in leadership programming to have the coach run it, or can other department administrators or other non-coaching staff members also have a role in leading leadership programming?
The legislation does not require the coach to run leadership programming. And are we talking about the new legislation, or are we talking about this other type of leadership programming between the coach and student athletes?
They didn't say, so if you feel okay speaking on both, maybe that would be helpful for them.
Sure, and I guess it would kind of depend on the type of leadership programming activity too. So I think that might be one that I would recommend you submit through RSRO. If you have something particular in mind, I would recommend submitting that factual scenario through RSRO, and it'll give staff the opportunity to assess whether it would be permissible.
Awesome, thank you. You're good to move to social media.
All right. So remember, this part of this presentation for social media is about how your coaches can stay involved with their student athletes outside the season. Another area where we get questions about their involvement is through social media when the engagement involves a reference to the student athlete's participation in voluntary athletically related activities. So Tiffany touched on this earlier. That analysis, you have to start that analysis by looking at the definition of what makes an activity, athletically related activity, voluntary, which can be found in Bylaw 170214. So in order for the activity to be voluntary, I'm just going to reiterate, there must be no reporting back to the coaching staff, and that would include the student athlete not reporting back, and the strength coach, trainer, or manager who otherwise may be observing or monitoring or conducting the activity, they could not report back either. The activity must be initiated solely by the student athlete, so neither the institution nor the athletics department staff member can require the student athlete to participate in the activity at any time. You cannot record the student athlete's attendance and participation in the activity or the lack thereof for purposes of reporting such information to the coaching staff members or other student athletes. And lastly, there cannot be a penalty or an award based on the student athlete's participation in the activity. So those bullet points are on the slide ahead. What we're going to do next is we're going to break up the social media engagement into student athlete interactions, what's permissible for student athletes to do on social media, and what's permissible for your coaches to do on social media. So if you have questions specific to what your institutional staff members can do, would ask that you hold until we reach that part. So you may be thinking, how am I supposed to monitor every single student athlete's social media account? In short, that's not the expectation, and nor is it realistic. When a student athlete posts about their voluntary workouts, it becomes your concern if it has some element of institutional involvement, because that would negate the voluntary nature of the activity. So we can test that through some of the examples that are on the slides, again, keeping at the forefront of our analysis those conditions that make an activity voluntary. So the student athlete posts photos and videos of voluntary athletically rated activities or workouts on their personal social media accounts. Is that permissible? The answer is yes, as you can see. If the student athlete is voluntarily posting their engagement in voluntary workouts, in other words, they're not directed by the athletic staff, then the post is fine on their personal social media page. The key is there's no real institutional involvement here. We just have a student athlete posting on their personal account what they're doing that summer. The next one, student athletes post photos or videos of voluntary workouts on a team or an athletics department account. Would that be permissible? The answer is no. They posted so in that example, they posted their out-of-season workouts on an institutional account. This would no longer make it voluntary, and it would be considered reporting back. The student athlete posting on the institutional account makes it an institutional action. When you go back to the voluntary nature of the activity, it starts to look much less voluntary when the institutional account that's run by the coach, the athletics department, et cetera, is posting about the student athlete's out-of-season voluntary workout. So what about if the student athlete posts on their personal social media page, but they tag the coach and the team account or an athletics department account? Again, this would be okay if the student athlete posts on their personal page, and it's even okay if they tag an institutional account because it's not being produced by the institution or one of their accounts. What would make this impermissible is if the coach engaged with that post by liking it or commenting or reposting it to the institutional account. So that action of responding to the student athlete's tagging of the coach or tagging of the institutional account reflects monitoring and acknowledging and recognizing, which would negate the definition of voluntary in 170214. So where there's a higher expectation of monitoring is when it comes to the actions taken by institutional athletic staff. So let's go through some examples to examine what's okay and what's not. Remember, this chart only pertains to their involvement with student athlete social media posts about voluntary workouts outside the season. And what drives that analysis is the definition of voluntary. Let's look at that first example. The coach posts photos of the student athletes engaging in voluntary workouts on a personal or team account. Is that okay? So it would not be permissible. In this example, the coach is recording the student athlete's participation in the activity, which negates the voluntariness of it. Also, we know that the coach's personal social media account cannot be divorced from his occupation as a coach. So this post would be impermissible if it was posted to an actual institutional account, and it would also be impermissible if it was posted to the coach's personal account. The next example, the coach likes or reposts the photos of student athletes engaging in voluntary athletically related activities. So we just talked about this one in the student athlete section. This is not permissible. As we noted earlier, the coach cannot take an action of approval of the student athlete's content. This would include liking, favoriting, or reposting because it indicates recognition of what's supposed to be a voluntary workout. So in these last two examples that we talked about, we're seeing a coach not only tracking what the student athlete is doing workout-wise out of season, but there's this extra step of recognizing their work in their sport outside the season. So by posting about it, liking it, reposting the student athlete's personal or voluntary post, that's what makes these activities no longer voluntary, because the coach is essentially endorsing the student athlete's participation in their out-of-season workouts. So to sum it up, this isn't permissible because it not only records the student athlete's participation, but it suggests the student athlete's work in the off-season is viewed favorably. And it's not that far of a stretch to say that the coach could view that student athlete more favorably in season, that there would be some type of award or reward for their participation in these out-of-season athletically related activities. So as we discuss these examples, you can see much of the analysis here seems more like a field test. But does it feel like the activity is no longer voluntary because of the institution's actions? And if you can even remotely, think that there's a chance that the answer could be yes, then you're probably right. That's why there's not really a ton of flexibility in this space. There certainly are examples where a coach can post about a student athlete engaging in voluntary athletically related activities. I'll get into those now. So you can see on the slide that it's okay for a coach to post about community service activities. Also, for example, if their student athlete's team placed first in their summer baseball league, there's a legislative exception that allows the coach to be there and to cheer on the student athlete in the summer baseball league with the conditions that the opportunity to view the activity is open to all, and the coach is not supervising or conducting the activity. So it's those conditions that protect the interest of the student athlete. So posting a picture of those activities would not compromise the Bylaw 17 concerns in the same way that posting a photo of voluntary workouts would. So sometimes we get this question, well, how does this apply to our strength and conditioning coach? The answer is that these concerns of, voluntary workouts, these concerns of posting also apply to strength and conditioning posts too. If the certified strength and conditioning coach posts a picture of a student athlete engaging in voluntary workouts out of season, we're back to those original concerns about negating the voluntary nature of the workouts. And that applies whether or not the strength coach is the sport-specific coach for the team they're posting about. The strength coach is an institutional athletic staff member recording or posting those voluntary workouts on the coach's account or the institutional account, and that serves as reporting back to the sport-specific coach. And we've already discussed that the coach posting these activities about their own team is not okay. So it goes above and beyond permissibly collecting data as a normal duty of the strength and conditioning coach if they're posting these activities on social media.
I've got a combo question for you, Caitlin. Can you speak a little bit about Instagram takeovers? So that's kind of a combo between what the team or institutional account might be doing and what a student athlete can do.
Absolutely. And I think, since we've also gotten this question in the COVID space, and you're probably wondering how this applies now too, I'll address both. So under existing legislation, and this is kind of pre-COVID, post-COVID, student athletes are allowed to participate in social media takeovers of institutional or team accounts outside their season, provided the student athletes are not displaying their voluntary workouts as part of those poster takeovers. So posting those voluntary workouts outside the season would negate the voluntary nature of it and not be permissible outside the season. So that is kind of under existing legislation to say it's okay as long as they're not posting their voluntary workouts. Now, unique to this summer and unique to the COVID-19 Administrative Committee flexibility is that it is permissible for the student athletes to use the institution or team's account to post their stories of their day and to include their workouts in that. So if, we know at this time this is being done outside their season, the student athlete participation needs to be voluntary, and the workouts, the virtual workouts that they may or may not perform through these Instagram takeovers or social media takeovers cannot be conducted or supervised by the coaches. So really this just reinforces, the position, the intent of the flexibility to foster the well-being of the student athlete and the connectivity between the student athletes and their institutions. I think it's still really important to reinforce that, this needs to be a voluntary activity. There shouldn't be any type of penalty or adverse consequences to not participating in these activities or rewards or incentives for participating in these activities.
All right, so this goes back to what you were talking about a student athlete reserving facilities and staff member involvement, or they shouldn't be involved in that. So the question is, while reserving a space, a student must request it, and that request goes to a member of our athletic staff. So technically, wouldn't that be an athletic staff member reserving the space?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if your normal reservation procedures require, like you've got a staff member who is over the books, you know, or is the one who types information into the computer for the reservation, that's okay. So a student athlete can then go to that person in the normal manner that reservation occurs and says, hey, from 1 to 2, I want to reserve the facility for, you know, for a pickup game with my teammates. That's fine. The restriction or that ILC discussed or in that educational column regarding voluntary out-of-season activities limited primarily to members of the same team specifically relates to when a coach or athletic staff member on their own makes a reservation. So a coach or the person who's overseeing the reservation system or the book or whatever's used couldn't on their own say from 1 to 2 the gym will be reserved for women's basketball or men's basketball team to have, you know, a pickup game. So yeah, it's a part of your normal reservation process as student athletes, you know, talking to a member of staff to make a reservation, that's okay. That staff member just can't do that on their own and designate a time as a time when the men's basketball team, women's basketball team, or any other team at your institution would be using that facility.
Just wanted to say a quick thank you for participating on today's webinar. If you do have any follow-up questions or you think of anything after this presentation, please feel free to reach out to staff through your compliance officer and use the RSRO system to submit your questions. We look forward to seeing you then.